So Christmas, as I'm sure you know, marks the birth of Jesus Christ, but there's plenty of evidence of midwinter festivals extending back to ancient Greek, Egyptian, and Roman times. Historians agree that many of today's Christmas traditions were actually borrowed from pagan practices, interestingly enough. The customs involving mistletoe, feasts, and even Santa Claus all originate from different pagan festivals. What else should we think about around this time? Well, Dr. Vashna Jagarnarth joins us now to explain why this time of the year is seen as a time to celebrate and also a moment for some kind of reprieve. Dr. Vashna, thanks very much indeed for joining us via our telephone line this morning. Really do appreciate your time. I mean, many will still be surprised as you and I speak that a lot of the customs and traditions around Christmas don't even have a religious background, so to speak, but come from pagan communities.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I think there's 2 points we need to make first up at the very beginning. And the first, that is Christianity itself is not, does not have its roots, as one would think, in a sort of Western paradigm world. That is a much later invention that's tied closely to the project of imperialism and so on. I mean, we know that Christ was born in present-day Palestine, which is hardly the heartland of sort of Western civilization. And the way in which Christianity spreads across the world means that along the way, in its project to convert people, it begins to adopt a lot of pre-existing festivals and celebrations that are already in place. You don't just have it with Christmas, you have it with Easter as well, which is tied to the fertility and the goddesses of fertility. For Christmas in particular, it goes back to ancient times and is tied to midwinter festivals. When, you know, at the heart of winter, can you imagine you are in the northern climates? People are, you know, worried that the harvest is not going to come. They're worried that summer is not going to come. They did not have meteorologists to tell them what the weather is going to be like. And a whole lot of celebrations and festivities were tied to that. Even things like the Yule log, that is the big log that people brought in during winter to keep their fires going. The things like what we call Father Christmas today is tied to Odin, who was sort of Norse mythology, grand old god of Norse mythology. And the idea was that he would be roaming through the world during this time, and you have to give him something. In fact, it's the other way around. You have to make sure you have something to give the old man, whereas now it's been turned on its head, and Father Christmas gives us presents.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of these various sorts of traditions that are tied to practices that have very little to do with a religious text or a background, but rather an incorporation of different customs and traditions in order to make the religion relevant to much more diverse groupings of people. And I think that should be celebrated, because often today, in the world we live in today, there's a big division around religion, as you well know. There's a big division about where does it come from, who controls who, what religion is seen as being legitimate and others are seen as not being legitimate. But the fact of the matter is that the three most dominant religions of the world today, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, come from the Middle East, something that's not spoken or highlighted enough.
Absolutely. In fact, a lot of the imagery, and perhaps capitalism has something to do with this, represent a kind of Christmas that takes place in the Northern Hemisphere. We'll speak about that in just a moment, especially when you consider what the context should be for us here in Africa, at least on the southern tip of Africa. However, what I was hoping to hone in on is this idea that scholars don't even necessarily agree on when the man in history who became to be known as Jesus Christ, this God who became man, was actually born. Interesting that in a context where the 25th of December is thought of as when Jesus was in a stable with Mary and Joseph and all the other animals and was actually born.
Yes, I mean, often, now there seems to be some sort of idea that if there was a man, Jesus, who becomes the Son of God, was probably born in what would be around September, October, or until August, that period. And that would make sense. Especially given the difficulties around traveling in midwinter, finding shelter in a barn, surviving the freezing cold weathers, giving birth, and so on. So for many, it's the actual date of Christmas has very little to do with the birth of Jesus Christ, and people still don't have any sixth sense. Now, one of the reasons for this is you must remember that most religions, as they're unfolding, or the events, what we come to be seen as the mythical or the foundational stories that make up religion, weren't written down in the immediacy of them happening. The story of Jesus Christ and his life was not written down when he was actually in existence, if he existed. It was written down 300 to 400 years later. Rather, it was told in oral stories. And as we know through that, people change and tell stories in a different way. Even the way people speak changes. If we have to think about the English language from just say Shakespearean periods till today, or even from the 1800s till today, the English language itself has changed so much. Meaning has changed so much. Even if the story doesn't change, how you tell it, where you attribute things. We know the calendar's changed in the last 140 years in the world, and, October is no longer what it used to be and didn't fall in the same historical period. So I think there's all of that we have to consider. And a lot of the work has been trying to figure out and place Jesus Christ in a moment through archaeological work, but that has been much more difficult to do. However, the reason why this midwinter festival was chosen was because it's such an ancient period in people's lives and imaginings, and it was something that was very difficult to get rid of. Even if you think about Easter, it's not necessarily the time when Christ may have been executed, but because it was so tied to the fertility festivals that were rampant across Europe, it was very difficult to shift people from what was then called, incorrectly, but what was called the pagan ways of living, to get them to buy into Christmas.
Sure.
And hence you had to use that.
Fascinating. How then, with all of that said, should those who are celebrating Christmas in the Southern Hemisphere look at this particular celebration? I mean, in my mind, there's a temptation to be envisioning things like snowmen, Christmas trees that have flakes of snow all around them, turkey in summer, which doesn't make sense for us. How should we how we respond to something like Christmas, given, again, what feels like a very hegemonic message from various aspects of society?
I think that is probably the most important question. If you looked at the history of Christmas over the longue durée, over the longest period of time, it's a festival that has been inclusive. In the ancient times, what would happen, in fact, and right up until the slave trade and slavery in the United States of America, during the period of Christmas, the world sort of was turned upside down on its head, and slaves would become in charge for 3 to 4 days, and the masters of slaves had to be slaves from Roman times, and the same happened in North America during slavery. And those 3 days were considered the days when the world was turned upside down, and you could do what you like, and there was a whole lot of freedom, right? And it was celebratory. And that doesn't really tie in very much of how we think about Christmas. And that is because the version of Christmas we have today is a version of Christmas that arises in a very particular moment in our history, tied deeply to imperialism and capitalism and the sort of imperial project of expansion. And in fact, what we understand to be Christmas celebrations, like sending out Christmas cards, the roast turkey, the stockings, all of these things actually come from Charles Dickens, the author, who wrote A Christmas Carol. And when he wrote A Christmas Carol, he wrote it in keeping with what was becoming the Victorianization of English culture under Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who brought some of the older German traditions into England to celebrate the sort of very Victorian family Christmas, which was about prayer, being at home, having the roast turkey, sitting around a fire, something that we cannot possibly do in the Southern Hemisphere.
Absolutely.
But even in doing that and trying to make it a very English Victorian project that is then sort of pushed around the world through the project of colonialism, it kind of failed. Because the very things that are thought to be at the center of this Christmas, like the turkey comes from Latin America and North America and could have only been possible because of imperialism. The fact that we're eating chocolates come from Mexico. That would have not been possible. The tree that they're talking about comes from the Nordic countries and Germany and so on. But very interestingly, during the abolitionist period of slavery, that is when the Christmas tree becomes important, because it becomes a symbol of the abolition of slavery. Because the abolitionists say, you'll keep the Christmas tree with such reverence and you can't touch it, but you don't want to talk about the issue of slaves, which actually have to do with human life.
Sure.
So it becomes a symbol of liberation. So there's all of these things, and Father Christmas being red comes directly out of Coca-Cola taking the decision to make him the color of Coca-Cola so that they could use Father Christmas to sell more Coke.
Sure. It's all very fascinating,
There's all of these things happening. But actually, when you look at the heart of it, Christmas and what all of the accoutrements and all of the stuff that goes into developing Christmas is a global story.
Yeah,
I think
Dr.
we should
Vashna,
all own it.
absolutely.
And we all celebrate it how we want to celebrate it.
Yeah, and hopefully that's the takeaway as we distill, I guess, information that for many people that be hearing for the first time, which I have no doubt will force them to pivot the way through which they've actually looked at Christmas. Thanks very much indeed for your time and for sharing your insights. Really do appreciate it. Dr. Vashna Jagarnarth is the director, actually, of Pan Africa Today. Once again, Doc, thanks very much indeed.